and welcome to the Total Soccer Show. I'm Daryl Grove and it's just me in studio today. Taylor will be back tomorrow. But don't worry, I'm not alone. On today's TSS, I'll be talking to Will Parchman. If you're a US national team fan, then you know Will Parchman's work. He writes for TopDrawerSoccer.com and MLSSoccer.com and has a deep knowledge about US youth national teams, plus the ins and outs of American soccer development. If you care about the future, Will is the man to listen to, and you should care about the future. I'll be talking to Will about the US Under-17s CONCACAF Championship final against Mexico, which happened last night. If you want to watch the game, it's on YouTube and the link is in the show notes. But, spoiler alert, here's what happened. The US went 1-0 up through a great Andrew Carleton turn and volley, which he made happen by pressuring Mexico's keeper. But Mexico equalised with a Carlos Robles header in the 91st minute. 91st minute. The game went to penalty kicks where Akil Watts missed his, put it over the bar, and Mexico scored all of theirs to take the CONCACAF title. But the US has qualified for the U17 World Cup and looked pretty entertaining in doing so. So I'll be talking to Will about the value of youth teams playing entertaining soccer, recent changes in US soccer youth development and how Jurgen Klinsmann both was and was not involved, the immediate future for guys like Andrew Carleton and Josh Sargent and all the names you know, what to look out for from the US at the U17 World Cup, and also what to expect from the US at the upcoming U20 World Cup. Okay, enough explaining, more conversating. Here's my chat with Will Parchman. Hello again to Will Parchman. Hello, Will.
Hi, how's it going?
Pretty good, except the US lost on penalties to Mexico. We're gonna get into that, but it's not all bad, right? It's not all bad.
No, in fact, I just finished writing a column where I kind of look back at I kind of had 5 big questions that the U.S. had to answer before this tournament. And to my satisfaction, I pretty much answered all 5. The final obviously was a ceremonial affair. It mattered in the sense that, players want trophies. They want to win as many as they can. And it was Mexico, and those games are always heated. Yeah. But the U.S. had already cinched up qualification, and that's what this tournament's for. And so the fact that they got to play in a high-pressure game in the final, they didn't lose in regulation, they held their own. Unfortunately, the penalties didn't go their way. But as far as I'm concerned, all of the things that we wanted to see before the tournament, leading up to the World Cup later this year in India, we pretty much saw all of them.
So can you give us I guess you can't give away all the Top Drawer Soccer content, but can you give us a little preview of like the things you were hoping to see from this team and the things that you did see?
Yeah, so some of the bullet points that I can kind of think of were, can the defense hold its own? Can Josh Sargent carry the load? Can they beat Mexico? Those were some of the big ones, and certainly all 3 of those they answered. Josh Sargent had 5 goals in this tournament that led the U.S. He had that one beautiful piece of skill against Mexico where he kind of chipped the defender in the box and then finished.
And chipped himself, right? He ducked under the chip to.
Yeah. I'm sure that went out to a few scouting departments and a few European clubs that are interested. But yeah. So Josh Sargent obviously upheld his end of the bargain. He's going to be one of the most effective scorers anywhere in the U17 World Cup later this year. The defense, I think, was a huge thing. They only had 11 shutouts in 33 games in 2016. And so a lot of us were kind of concerned, would they be able to weather the storm? CONCACAF is always a little bit better than people expect, even on the youth level. Yeah. And they were able to do that. I mean, certainly there were cracks. I think AJ Vasquez had a pretty rough tournament, the FC Golden State center back. James Sands, I think, rightly projects more as a defensive midfielder than a center back, and you kind of saw that a little bit. I mean, he had a good tournament, but the pairing between those two wasn't great. That said, they did enough defensively to put the U.S. in positions to win all their games and not lose any of them. Yes, they gave up 3 goals against Mexico, and they gave up the late one against Mexico in the final to sort of force that shootout, but they did enough to sort of push them into a good position. So those were 2 of the big ones that we saw. Would the U.S. be able to score? Could it keep its attacking shape? They've kind of crumbled down the stretch in the last 2 cycles, albeit under different coaching. They didn't do that this time. They really sort of stuck to what makes them good. And to their credit, this U17 team was legitimately fun to watch. I mean, you could sit down at a game and watch them sort of build attacks and go, either through the middle or wide. There was a lot of individual skill on play, but there was also some pretty good, quality team play at work too. So I think all of those things we wanted to see, we pretty much saw all of them.
Yeah, the goal that stands out to me, I think it was against Honduras, was the chip into Sargent, and he lays it back, and then Ferry lifts it over, and then Akinola runs onto it. And it just seemed like a team that was all on the same page. So that had me really excited in terms of team play.
Yeah, and I think there's still some questions. I mean, this team, familiar American problem, they don't really have a dedicated number 10, which is kind of frustrating when you think back the last cycle. The U.S. had Christian Pulisic, but lacked sort of that wide technical gravitas. And this time they have that wide play, but they sort of need that number 10. So Pulisic, unfortunately, not U17 eligible anymore. But the guy they tried to put there was George Acosta, the Weston FC midfielder, who did pretty darn well in spurts. But for whatever reason, John Hackworth kind of yo-yoed with him in and out of the lineup, didn't really like what he was getting full time over 90 minutes. So they tried a few different things, but I still think the U.S. is kind of soft creatively up the middle. There was a bit of a gap between that front line of Akinola, Sargent, and Carleton and sort of the rest.
Yeah.
They were able to close that up because, as you mentioned, Blaine Ferry had a good tournament. Chris Goslin, the Atlanta United midfielder, played pretty well at times. He's more of a number 8. And then Chris Durkin, obviously the DC United number 6, did well as well. But that's an area where we want to see some improvement maybe in the next couple months. I'm not sure what the answer is necessarily, but yeah, I mean, overall, you watch the way this team passed and moved, and it's clearly, if not the deepest cycle we've ever seen, then certainly up in the top 3.
Should there be any cause for concern about the way that the US team in the final couldn't hold on to that lead? We had that Josh Sargent chance in the last 10 minutes, and I think it was Goslin hit the post in like the 89th, and then conceding that late goal. I'm of two minds of is that just, all right, these are like U17s, they're literally kids, right? So maybe you can't expect them to have all the experience of how to close out a game, or is it something that we should be worried about going into the U17 World Cup?
No, I actually think there's more to be learned from this team losing a lead like that than if they held on. And I say that because the results themselves don't really matter in 5 to 10 years. I mean, maybe a couple of us soccer nerds will remember, but nobody will really remember what happened in this tournament. What we're going to remember is how, these players sort of had adversity and responded to it, and that makes them better players down the road. So, what you get developmentally by losing a lead late in a game is now you can pinpoint that on the training field and say, what did we do? You can look at tape, say, this is how we responded, and you need to respond differently. And I mean, you hear all the time from coaches, you learn more from a loss than you do from a win. Well, this wasn't a loss necessarily, at least not in regulation, but certainly they'll find a way to sort of shore up late, what they weren't able to do against Mexico. So I actually think that this is going to be more beneficial to them down the road, because it's going to stick with them. It's going to fester a little bit. They're going to think about it, and they're going to want to improve on it. So yes, it stings now, but I think down the line in developmental terms, things like that do help you become better.
Does that apply also to Akil Watts, who missed the penalty kick?
Yeah, it's interesting. I put this on Twitter that in 2015, the U17 team was in a playoff with Jamaica. They had kind of scuffled a little bit. They had lost to Jamaica in the group stage, so they needed this game just to get to the World Cup. I mean, they hadn't cinched it up yet, and the game was scoreless. U.S. didn't play well. They go to penalties. First kick up, Christian Pulisic, and he biffs it. He missed the kick. So the U.S. is now behind from the start against Jamaica, and they have to make up that miss somewhere, and they do. They overcome it, and they make the World Cup. Pulisic goes on to be, Captain America and BVB and whatever. That would be my message to Akil Watts, is that, he had a pretty good tournament. I mean, he wasn't the first choice fullback coming in, but he won that job against Mexico. He sort of won his spot on the field. And yes, he missed the kick. But one thing, if I was John Hackworth, and I'm sure this is what he's doing to impress upon kids at that level, is that this is all a learning experience. We were in the World Cup already. You didn't let your team down. yes, we lost the penalty kicks, but at the end of the day, look where Christian Pulisic is right now. He's not stewing over that. He used that to sort of fuel the fire of his career. So, yeah, it's going to stick with him. It's just the nature of the game. But at the end of the day, he's got some pretty good company.
So, looking ahead to, I think it's October, the U17 World Cup in India. I know that I think of you as an expert in the US youth setup, obviously, but I also know it's not fair to expect you to have an in-depth knowledge of every other youth setup that's going to be at the World Cup. But could you give us a rough idea of how you feel about the US, not necessarily winning the tournament, but at least having an impressive tournament? I guess my question is, what is an impressive tournament for this US under-17 team?
Well, getting out of the group would be a good start.
Better than last time.
Yeah, well, they missed the entire tournament in 2013, and then they were just sort of blown out of the water in Chile 2 years ago. So I think that they need to set that benchmark. I mean, it's the same with the men. I mean, there's no question that getting out of the group is sort of the baseline expectation.
Right.
But at a youth tournament, it's less important to me about where you finish. It's more important to me at how you look, how you play. Mm-hmm. Do you stick to your attacking principles? Are you solid at the back? Do you not try to abandon what you've done for 2 years just to try to get through a tournament that, winning is ultimately immaterial? Because the U.S. has been bad at that. The youth national team level, no matter what, we're talking U17s or U20s, they've really, gotten away from sort of the business of development at big tournaments and sort of taken a senior team approach of win at all costs, which is just disaster for development. Right. It sort of teaches all the wrong things to the kids. They don't get to, sort of assert the level of skill that you would want, young players to do. And ultimately, things don't usually turn out very well because you're getting away from what you do best. So what I want to see from the 17s in India is just to see them play with the sort of verve that they've played with, not only throughout the cycle, but in Panama as well, because that's going to help them down the road, because now they're learning to apply what they've learned on the biggest stage possible. And if you can play through the middle, if you can, put some pretty goals in the net at that level, that's exactly what the 99 team did with Landon Donovan, DeMarcus Beasley, and Kyle Beckerman, and Okuchi Onyewu. And ever since then, it's just been a slow erosion of results over development. And I think if we can see the U.S. get back to that, we'll see that 99 class start to come out in more classes.
When I watch Carleton and Sargent play, I just see two really confident players who are sort of, to paraphrase Bruce Arena, sort of willing to try things. And I think I cannot see a tournament where someone tells Andrew Carleton to just only track back and then play the simple ball every time. And I even feel like, I've never met him. I don't really have a good read on it, like exactly the type of guy he is. But my guess is that he wouldn't be capable of doing that. Like he almost has to roulette, right?
Well, you would think. And yes, to some degree, he always will sort of, try things. But watch back the 2015 team in the World Cup, especially in the second half, I believe it was against Croatia. They had a 2-0 lead against Croatia, and the coaching staff basically told them to quit and to track back and to play defensive. And you wouldn't expect Christian Pulisic to be sort of one-note, hard line, clearance-oriented midfielder. But he was. I mean, he sort of went hammer and tongs at guys, and it didn't suit their style of play, and they cratered, and they ended up losing a 2-0 lead, and they drew 2-2, and they should have lost 3-2 because Croatia hit the bar with like 2 or 3 minutes left. And that's sort of an example of what has been too often seen on that level, where you have guys sort of call off the dogs as opposed to, showing some real verve and letting these kids off the leash. So as long as that happens, and as long as guys like Carleton are allowed to just sort of be and create and make mistakes, and then that's okay, then the World Cup will be a really fun affair, just like Panama was.
So is it fair to say that's the main thing you'll be watching for at the World Cup?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to enjoy watching soccer. I mean, I know that's a crazy thing to say, but I think all of us at our core want to sit down and watch a game and be entertained. And I think there's some sort of like recoil at that, especially at the senior level, because you're thinking, well, the game's not to be enjoyed, the game's to be won. But I think the two go hand in hand. I think if you're playing a pleasing style and you're attracting those types of players, then you're going to naturally play, athletic, quality, fun soccer. And there's not any one way to do that. Leicester City was a blast in, 2015-16, and they played very direct, but they were a lot of fun to watch. So I think that's a pretty good litmus for me on a youth level, is if a team is fun to watch and they're doing things the right way, they're usually leading into better teams down the road. And so if the U.S. is enjoyable, if you can sit down and not want to shoot yourself for 90 minutes of youth soccer, then I think something good's happening.
Yeah, actually, I had this conversation with Taylor that I kind of like seeing the expression and risk-taking at the youth level, because that will get it will get rounded off a little more maybe when you become a senior professional, and maybe you work for some Dom Kinnear type coach who wants to drill stuff into you. But at least if you've got that sort of as a base level of skill and expression and know how to do those things, it makes you a more complete player, even if the edges get rounded off by some coach later on.
Yeah, and there's got to be space. I mean, for all of Jurgen Klinsmann's faults, one of my favorite things that he would always harp on the youth level, and senior level too, but mainly youth level, is that coaches need to ease off a little bit. And we have this thing in American sports where coaches are sort of helicopter. If you think about basketball, coaches are basically yelling for 48 minutes or 40 minutes or however long your game is. Football is it's maybe a little bit less that, but it's a tinker sport. I mean, you're always involved. You're doing something at all times. And so on the youth level, when there's not as much scrutiny on how coaches act, coaches have a tendency to do that. And so players start looking to the sideline and wondering, what do I do in this situation? And it totally kills creativity, because now they're not thinking with their feet. They're thinking sort of, what now? Tell me what to do. And so I think the further away we get from that, and you see that with guys like Andrew Carleton especially. I talked with Tony Annan, who's one of the academy directors at Atlanta United, and he took this methodology course that MLS is pairing with the French Federation now. It's a fantastic course. And one of their main thrusts with MLS academy coaches is to pull back and let coaches. They have a discovery phase at the beginning of every practice where you just sort of provide very minimal. You only provide questions. You don't actually answer anything. You're just saying, why are you doing that? What was that for? But it's minimal. And so you're allowing players to sort of go through their paces and figure out what they're doing on their own. And then the next phase is you have more sort of a regimented answer period to say, this is why you did that, and this is what I need you to do. And Carleton's a product of that. Obviously, he spent more time in Georgia United before they became Atlanta United, but Annan came with him from Georgia United. So he's been sort of steeped in this questioning phase and being allowed to create phase for years. And so I think the more players that are creative, they've been allowed to answer their own questions in the field and then provided sort of the material resources to add on that down the road. So the more we see that and get away from this helicopter coaching, I think the more players like Carleton we'll see.
So at risk of diverting us into another topic, do we give Jurgen Klinsmann credit for bringing that mindset to US soccer at all ages, top to bottom? Because I was one of those people who was very critical of his lack of instruction for the senior team, because I thought that was you need it at that level when you're playing, say, Mexico in November. But is that a mindset that he brought and was adopted, or is it just a coincidence that he was there at the same time as someone like Annan?
Well, I think the credit for the youth stuff actually goes to the youth coaches, because Klinsmann didn't really spend much time, on that level drilling guys. He wasn't even the technical director of the youth teams. That was Tab Ramos. So, right. I mean, I think if anything, his just sort of general, I think I called him the prognosticator in chief a lot, just because he would sort of throw these vague ideas out there and then see if they would trickle down to coaches below him. Sometimes they would. Most of the times they wouldn't. But one of the biggest benefits, I think, was him just basically telling everybody to relax. Yes, you need more pressure on kids. Yes, you need to up, the sort of the quality of the development academy. We need to do all these things. But players need to stop thinking so much. Coaches need to stop yelling so much. And you need to just let the game breathe. And I think that sort of was a two-edged sword, because it killed him on the senior team level, because he let things breathe way too much. And sort of he didn't really have the tactical backbone to sort of back all that up and to say, okay, I'm letting things breathe, and now I got to step in and do this, this, and this. But on the youth level, I think that message really resonated, and I think it was important to hear because we really did need to sort of back off a little bit and let players sort of create their own landscapes, if you will. And so I hope that message that he had kind of given of like, just relax, step back a little bit, don't be so demonstrative, let kids, figure it out on their own at times. I think that's a beneficial thing, and I hope it sort of sticks around.
I also want to ask you, that was really interesting, by the way, so I'm going to mull some of that over, because it's a thing of like a lot of people are either pro-Klinsmann or anti-Klinsmann, and then we've been talking a lot on the show recently about how things can be two things, right? It can be good for one thing and bad for another thing. It sounds like that may be the situation with the Klinsmann approach.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't think Klinsmann was all bad. I mean, he did have some positive influences on the youth level, mostly with the people he put into place to do things that he wasn't doing. Right. But yeah, I mean, I think he's just a mentality guy. He wasn't really a X's and O's guy. He wasn't really a utility guy. He was a sort of a broad tone setting, this is sort of where I want us to be in 30 years kind of guy. And, it takes a long time for that to crystallize. And so when you're in a World Cup qualifying campaign and Klinsmann's talking about how players need to challenge themselves and he wasn't good enough, and what does that mean? Well, I don't know what it means. There wasn't enough concrete answers as to why he was doing certain things the way he was doing, which was disastrous for the senior team. But as far as mentality goes, it's hard to argue with some of the things he was saying, even though, I really enjoy MLS. I write for the website. I enjoy sitting down and watching games on the weekend, but it's hard to argue with some of the things he was saying about challenging yourself at a higher level. And some of the players that go to Europe are, demonstrably better when they go there. So, yes, some of it stings, but I think some of it was just pointing out some neuroses that we have as American soccer fans that we're unwilling to sort of admit to ourselves. Yeah. And of course, some of it was just garbage. So you just kind of have to pick out which one's which.
Well, speaking of like whether to go to MLS or Europe, I'm really interested in what the guys from this U17 team do next, especially because it feels to me like, at least among like soccer nerds like ourselves, but also I think among quite a lot of fans, guys like Andrew Carleton and Josh Sargent now kind of have a profile, right? Like people are interested in what they do next. And I'm really curious about like, how long until Andrew Carleton makes his MLS debut for Atlanta? Like, how long before Josh Sargent sort of basically has to choose what he's going to do and who he's going to play for? So I'm wondering if you could give me an idea of the timeline I should be looking at. Like, is it too soon to expect Carleton to make his MLS debut? Does Sargent have time to choose? Like, where are we at here?
A lot of it just depends on your club situation. And I think Atlanta United is so strong, in particular on the wings. They've got Villalba and Almiron and, just a ton of width in possible wide places that it's been difficult. Assad, it's been difficult for Carleton to find time. It's a 16-year-old. Yeah. There's also a sort of a lesser talked about facet that coaches don't like to put, youth national team players who are in sort of this sort of season into matches, because they know they're going to lose them again. Yeah. And so getting guys, consistently with the first team and getting everybody comfortable, and then here comes the U17 World Cup. Here comes U20 World Cup. We're going to lose them for 6 weeks. So I know that's certainly the case of a couple of U20 kids, but that's something to watch. But I think Carleton, I would be surprised if he didn't get at least 1 or 2 shots this year. He's young. He's still 16. I don't really mind Tata Martino slow playing that a little bit. Once you get to 18, 19, then that's something different. But so for the MLS guys, I think it may be a little early to start bristling for minutes and saying why isn't he playing. But for guys like Carleton, guys like George Acosta, who you mentioned earlier, who aren't in MLS development academies, who haven't been signed to homegrown deals, those guys I think it's far more interesting. Because they're not 18 yet. I'm not certain that anyone on this team who isn't signed has an EU passport, which means all of them would have to wait until they're 18. I could be wrong about that, but at least for most of the big guys, they aren't. Right. And so, which means they'll have to wait till next year to actually go. But as we've seen, with Nick Tatagwe, who a Virginia kid who just recently signed for Schalke. He's basically a Schalke player, halfway through his 17th year. He just had to wait officially until he was 18 to sign. So we could see that happen. Josh Sargent toured Germany over this winter break, went to a couple different clubs, actually did train with Schalke, went to Werder Bremen and a couple others. I would be surprised if he wasn't in Europe by the time he's 18. He's just that good. And I'm not sure Sporting KC put a homegrown claim on him because he's in their territory. He's from St. Louis.
Yeah, which is like half the United States is Sporting KC's territory.
Yeah, right. I'm not sure that's interesting to him, at least not when you've got, Americans proving themselves in Germany and he's being, tapped as maybe one of the best ones to possibly go over there. I think that's probably intriguing to him, like it would be for anybody. So he's probably, him and George Acosta, I think, are the two most interesting ones because Acosta is really technical. He can make an imprint over there. And then Sargent obviously is, his scoring acumen translates anywhere. So he could, I assume, he's got a pick of clubs that are interested in him, especially after we mentioned that ridiculous goal against Mexico.
So yeah, it could be like go and perform in the World Cup. Then he's then still got time to wait till he's 18, but he could just train with, say, Schalke until he turns 18, and then he's good to go.
Yep.
And then we all watch Schalke in the future.
Yeah, Schalke America. It's all right. We already got it. We add another one. It'll be 4 kids, 4 American kids. It'll be incredible.
One other thing I want to ask you about is the residency program, the U17 residency program, which I read a couple of months ago they announced is coming to an end. And the rationale is that the development academies are taking the place of what the residency program is doing. Is that have I got that story correct? And what do you read into that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because as I understand it, this U17 team, with the exception of Weah, seems to have mostly been residency guys who are living in Bradenton, Florida, sort of almost year round.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, in my view, it's an overdue thing. U17 residency was basically established to bridge the gap between, early club, so like U14, U15, and professional or college, mostly college, when it was set up in 1999. But the reason why it became outmoded is in 2007, the Development Academy came along, and over the next 10 years, it basically developed into a better place for young kids to develop than Bradenton. So what you're doing is you're taking kids out of their club environment, away from their club coaches that, have known them, they grew up with, or, at least have been with for a little while. And you're basically airdropping them into this academy where they may play a different style. They've got different coaching ethic. It's sort of almost a Team USA scenario, like from the old NASL, where it was just not very practical in a long view. And that's not to say that it didn't help develop kids, but it was clear the Development Academy is doing a better job of it than Bradenton was. So their decision to scuttle it was basically entirely related to the fact these kids all have places to go. And it's not like, Bradenton was pulling random kids that, didn't have, Development Academy upbringings or any place to play. I mean, these are kids, mostly in top MLS academies that are getting looks by, international scouts and players, and Weah, obviously guys like that are already in Europe. So the fact that they decided to shutter it was basically them admitting that the systems in place have grown to the point that Bradenton, frankly, is pretty irrelevant. And it's good that they saw that, even if it was maybe a couple years past due.
So it is a positive move then to now say the development academies, they can handle the weight of developing these kids. We don't have to bring them all to Florida.
Yeah, exactly. And part of the bonus from Florida was the fact that they were using IMG Academy's facility, which if you've ever been down there, it's a tremendous facility. They've got great grass fields. The school's right there. It's a residency. They're there full time, and you can kind of eat, breathe, and sleep soccer. There aren't that many residency academies in MLS, so from that standpoint, okay, there may be somewhat of a step back. You're traveling, but the training requirements now for the Development Academy are to the point where the benefit of sending these elite kids to Bradenton is mitigated by what they can do at their home academy. So it's definitely a positive.
So they get multiple practices a week at the academies?
Yeah, it's I believe it's now on the older levels is mandated 5 days a week. 4 or 5. I believe it's 5 days a week. I know I talked to Juan Carlos Michia, who's the director down at Weston FC, which has produced a ton of youth national team kids the last couple of years, and he said that they practice all their kids 5 times a week, and the game is 6. So they're on the field for almost every day of the week with 1 day off, which is frankly, it's how they do it in Europe. So it's a good development.
I knew I'd read that somewhere, and I just realised it was from your piece for Top Draw Soccer. So my one worry is, what about poor old John Hackworth? Is he going to be wandering the halls of the IMG Academy, like looking at empty dorm rooms, thinking of times gone by?
The ghost of the U17s?
Yeah.
No. I assume he'll stick. The U17 national team isn't going anywhere. It's just the residency is getting scuttled. So now the U17s will be like any other national team where, they'll have camps and they'll get call-ins. It'll still be a routine thing. It's just there isn't one home for them. So I would assume, based on the job he's done, if he doesn't get a promotion, then John Hackworth will continue on as the U17 coach. And just live life like a more normal national team coach, where he's not, posted up at an academy for months at a time.
All right, so it's good for Hackworth. He'll have a little more free time in between.
Yeah. Take a trip to Jamaica where he doesn't have to play.
I also want to look ahead to the U20s, because that U20 World Cup is coming fast, right? May 20th. I see that the tournament starts in South Korea.
Yeah, it's coming up. Tab Ramos the coach there is really dragging his feet on giving us the roster. It may be out, by the time listeners hear this, but yeah, it's interesting. The U20s are a little bit more, I would say, scrappy than the U17s. They're a little bit more pragmatic in the way they go about it. Part of that is just Tab Ramos. I think his style is more this like sort of counter press, where they really like to harry the ball and then hit really quick. You're not going to see a whole lot of like fluid interchange, which it's fine. You don't need, this like sort of Barcelona-esque style of play with everybody. It doesn't fit, but but when you watch them, you'll see that. It's how the US U20s beat Mexico 1-0 in qualifying, and it was every inch of a 1-0 game. It was very hard fought, and every inch was a battle and counter-attacking goal, and so you won't see sort of the more high-minded principles of the game, but this U20 team is quality. They should do some damage.
Do we see Eric Palmer-Brown at defensive midfield or at centre-back in this tournament? Because I know we had a long talk about that in the preview to the U20 CONCACAF qualifiers, and we were both not excited about Eric Palmer-Brown defensive mid, not excited after the first game where they lost, but then it kind of worked out, right?
Yeah, it did to a degree. I can actually quote a source here, several sources actually, and tell you that I have it on high authority that Tab Ramos will almost certainly be moving Palmer Brown back to center back for the World Cup. Part of that is the uncertainty around Justin Glad, the captain there, or the sub captain, I should say, behind Palmer Brown. Got an injury in qualifying. For this tournament, actually. And he hasn't featured for RSL all year. He's a starter for them. And so there's some question about when he would come back. It's pretty soon. It's probably in the next couple of weeks, but probably not soon enough to insert back into the lineup. And even if it is, I think we probably see Palmer Brown drop back and play with Tommy Redding. If not, and Glad's back, I think the ideal is to drop Palmer Brown back, play him next to Glad, and then sort of push in some of those Euro kids that are coming into the sort of the deeper midfield.
Yeah. Can we talk about those Euro kids? Because I think a lot of people may be familiar with this U20 team from the recent-ish CONCACAF tournament, but it was very domestic, right? But you've got a lot of really kind of high-profile, at least in our world, youth players over in Europe who I assume that Tab Ramos will be trying to get on this roster.
Yeah, you know what's funny is that a certain Gedion Zelalem is actually eligible for this tournament.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about.
Really, really interesting when you think about it. He was at the last one and played. The question is whether his form is good enough. I think the U.S. pool, especially at his position, is in a place now where you can legitimately make a case that he's not the most talented number 8 that they can put in there. I think you can't bench Tyler Adams. He had an immense qualifying tournament. He's been getting some minutes for the Red Bulls first team. So
yeah, he's a player that almost disproves the idea that coaches don't want to play the U20 kids, which I definitely believe is a thing. Like I look at Eric Palmer-Brown not playing for Sporting KC, but it seems like Tyler Adams is so good that they couldn't not play him for New York Red Bulls. Yeah,
it would have been nonsense for Jesse Marsh to bench him for no reason. But yeah, Tyler Adams for me was the best American player in qualifying, and so I think he's going to play. Ideally, you'd have Weston McKennie, the Schalke midfielder, number 6, FC Dallas kid that went over before his 18th birthday. He's probably the best player on this team if he gets called in. He's played for the Schalke first team in a friendly, looked pretty good.
Yeah.
And so if he gets into the team, I think that's the primary reason you drop Palmer-Brown back. I wouldn't have him in the defensive midfield to begin with, but McKennie is the choice there. And so if you have a McKennie deeper and then you have Tyler Adams in front of him, now you're talking about a midfield that can really do some damage and play some fun soccer.
Two other names I'm thinking of are Makweli Akele, who I believe is somewhere in La Liga, and Josh Perez, who I think has seen the field for Fiorentina in Serie A this year. So, are those guys that could have a chance of making this roster?
Yeah, Kale is really interesting. The guy you mentioned, he's at Villarreal in Spain, and he's played mostly for their third team, I believe, in the Spanish 4th division. So he's been down the pecking order a little bit. Small, creative guy. Usually put him on the wing. Not sure what his form is. My streaming capabilities for the Spanish 4th division are admittedly small. But yeah, he's an option. Josh Perez, I think, is a guy that Tab Ramos actually singled out after the qualifying tournament and said we couldn't get him out of Europe. Fiorentina wouldn't release him.
Right.
And so I think that's a no-brainer because Tab's on record as saying he loves him, and Perez played in the U17 World Cup and one of those fast-track guys. So he'll be there sort of maybe as a right wide midfielder. Nick Tatagwe, the guy we mentioned at Schalke is really interesting. But the most interesting name to me in this entire player pool is Haji Wright.
Oh, okay.
Wide player, sort of one of these devastating, winger types, not the most technically inclined, but just a menace in space. He has gotten, to my knowledge, he's gotten 0 call-ups to this U20 team under Tab Ramos, after being the most featured player under Richie Williams, who was then the U17 coach in the previous 2013-15 cycle. So that I'm curious to know the backstory of that, is why Haji Wright hasn't featured at all for Tab Ramos, whether it's Schalke didn't ever want to release him or Tab didn't rate him or whatever the reason. Haji, even if he doesn't start, I mean, how you don't have a Schalke U19 player, at least in the discussion would be beyond me. So that would be one interesting thread to watch, is if he doesn't even make the roster, is why.
So we know from the Total Soccer Show scouting network that he's been banging in goals for the Schalke U19s. So it's not as if he's out of form in front of goal. Yeah, so he's certainly an interesting one to watch. So I think those are some of the Euro kids that that obviously are keeping tabs on. Another one, Danny Barbier. Oh yeah, I've heard of him. Yeah.
Who's been bouncing around in England for a little while. He's been with Manchester City. Now he's with West Brom. So he's just a towering center back. Again, was also with the U17 World Cup team 2 years ago. Hasn't been talked about quite as much with sort of the immense amount of talent, U20 talent they have at center back. I mean, Cameron Carter-Vickers is eligible. I don't know if Tottenham Hotspur will release him, but he's certainly a number one, no doubt starter if they can pull him out.
Well, I mean, I would say to Pochettino that they no longer have a title running. At least they won't by the end of this week, right?
Yeah, and even if Carter-Vickers was contributing to it, there's no point in sort of hanging on to him.
Yeah. Okay, well, anything else that I haven't asked you about? I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, so I'm kind of a completist. Before we say goodbye, I want to ask if there's anything I haven't asked about.
I think we pretty much did the rounds. I think we went around the world of U.S. national team coverage.
One thing I would like to ask you, I saw Fox Sports will be broadcasting the U20 World Cup. Are you a stay up late to watch it guy, a get up early to watch it guy, or a stick it on the DVR and watch it the next day guy?
I can't do live sports on the DVR. I don't know what it is. I get too antsy. It's already happened. I want to look up how, what happened, the highlights or whatever. So yeah. If it happens at 2 a.m., God love it. I'm going to be up at 2 a.m. to watch.
Brew some coffee?
Yeah, do something. Maybe get some scotch or something. Who knows?
All right, well, here's to that. Hopefully we can talk to you again around the U20 World Cup.
Cheers, let's do it.
So there you go. That was Will Parchman. Thank you to Will for appearing on TSS. If you want to see more of his work, again, it's topdrawersoccer.com, MLSsoccer.com, or find him on Twitter at Will Parchman. Link will be in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's show and you're looking for ways to support TSS, then I have several options for you. First is you could go to totalsoccershow.com/subscribe. Take a voluntary subscription. We'll add you to what we call the TSS Scouting Network, where we give you a talented young player to scout, or you can just contribute and not scout if that's what you prefer. If you'd like to wear some of our merchandise, you can get a Total Soccer Show Hello and Welcome scarf, or a TSS t-shirt with the TSS logo, or a TSS t-shirt with a 4-2-3-1 formation on it. Both of those can be found, all three of those can be found at totalsoccershow.com/shop. Or if you don't want to part with your hard-earned dollars, and I very much understand if you don't, then you could just spread the word about the Total Soccer Show. An iTunes review, a Stitcher review, a Facebook review, or just telling a friend, like introducing a friend, say, hey, here's this soccer show, I think you should listen. That would also be great. So thank you to everybody for taking the time to listen to today's show, and we'll be back with you again tomorrow.